Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So, I'm going to speak about refugee children and young people navigating resettlement and inclusion. So, just to kind of give you an overview, if I can move, of my presentation. So, I'm going to look at how refugee children and young people navigate resettlement and inclusion, and I suppose in particular to look at some of the microsystems in which they're based, so particularly their parental the staff and peer microsystems, and how they support the navigation of resettlement and inclusion, and what challenges there are in that regard. I'm going to look then at how the broader kind of macro systems impact on resettlement and inclusion, and then I'll look at priorities for future directions. And I guess in the presentation I'm going to draw on some of my own research and some other research as well, just in trying to illustrate some of the points. Okay, so I might start just with a little bit of terminology. Probably a lot of you are familiar with the terms, but just in case people aren't, I thought it might be important to just do this. So, an international protection applicant is somebody who arrives in the country to seek protection from the state. So many of you are probably familiar with the term asylum seekers, so it includes asylum seekers, but also people who seek other forms of protection, such as subsidiary protection. And when somebody has been assessed in relation to their protection concerns, if somebody's successful, they receive refugee status or subsidiary protection. And then programme refugees are slightly different, in the programme refugees arrive in Ireland through organised programmes through the state upon request from the UNHCR. So UNHCR would maybe identify people in a refugee camp in somewhere like Lebanon, for example, and then the Irish government would commit to taking numbers of people from Lebanon into Ireland. So sometimes programme refugees have fled a conflict zone, spent a considerable period of time in a transit country, and then arrive in Ireland to be resettled, and they don't have to go through the asylum process because they already have their refugee status. And then I guess, I'm very conscious that many of you are probably working with Ukrainian refugees at the moment. And so just to briefly mention the temporary protection mechanism. So this is a mechanism at EU level where, when there is a particular situation or conflict, people are given temporary protection in EU states. So we've given temporary protection to Ukrainian refugees, so they have protection for a year, and it's likely that would be renewed maybe for a further 6 months or a year. So they don't have refugee status beyond that, but they have temporary protection, and it again means that they're not going through the asylum process, so they have a lot of the rights that citizens would have. Okay, so that's just a little piece on the terminology. And then just, I suppose, to mention as well about the different cohorts of refugee children and young people. So there's children and young people who arrive to seek international protection, so they arrive as asylum seekers, and many of you are familiar with our direct provision system that many of those children and young people would live in. There are children and young people who arrive via resettlement schemes, so these are young people who may have lived, for example, in Lebanon and then arrive in Ireland, and they generally go into emergency reception and orientation centres before then moving on to live in housing in different communities around the country. There are children who arrive accompanied, so with their parents, and then there's children who arrive who are unaccompanied. And then the final cohort that I mentioned there is just children who arrive to be reunited with family members, or children and then also children sometimes are here and subsequently their family members become reunited with them. So a lot of different, I suppose, to highlight the diversity of this population and the different kind of situations that people are in, I'm going to focus more today on children who arrive accompanied, so with their family members, and children who arrive and who are generally living in congregated settings, so in settings like direct provision or emergency reception and orientation centres. That's where my primary focus is, but I'll speak a little bit about some of the other cohorts. Okay, so just, I suppose, to give an overview of the experiences generally of refugee children and young people, and in the migration literature there tends to be this kind of distinction made between the different phases, if you like, of becoming a refugee. So there's the pre-migration experiences that refugee children and young people have in their country of origin, and again at the moment, because there's so much media attention on Ukraine, we have probably learnt a lot about that, or the general public as well have learnt a lot about those situations. So children, for example, having to live underground for safety for long periods of time, not having no access to education, no access to school, seeing violence taking place, they're being separated maybe from members of their family who are engaged in the conflict, etc. And then people leave, and we have the experiences of migration and transit, so where people are fleeing the conflict zone. And again, we've seen the challenges and the very difficult situations people are in during that journey, where sometimes we've seen conflict actually coming to the place where the person is fleeing. So railway stations being bombed, for example, people leaving and then going to another country and being in very precarious kind of situations in those countries initially, and then perhaps moving on to another country. And then the post-migration experiences, which is more of my focus here today. So the post-migration experiences in a country like Ireland, where people are adjusting to a new culture, a new environment, and again, often living in kind of precarious situations. And I think this quote from Summerfield is very nice. So refugee children and young people face a rupture in the narrative threads running through their lives. I think another important point to kind of say here is that often we think about refugee children as a lot of the things that I've just said. So traumatized, experiencing, having fled conflict, and the separation from families, etc. But of course, refugee children also had very ordinary lives before the conflict maybe, or the persecution started to take place, and also often during it. So there are ordinary aspects that are threaded through that. So, and you see that sometimes in pictures in the media, where you might see, for example, refugee children playing in the rubble of somewhere. So they're making their own childhood, and they're making that opportunity to play even in those contexts. And I think that's something that's really important to think about as we work with refugee children. Okay, so then resettlement. So when I talk about resettlement, there are lots of different definitions of it, but this is basically the process of settling into a country and becoming established. So I like this idea of this process of growth of personal and social development within a safe and stable context of possibility. And then the idea of inclusion, again, the ability to participate, I suppose, on an equal basis, the experience of a sense of belonging and the feeling of being connected to a host society. So just drawing, I suppose, loosely on Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, I'm going to talk a little bit about the child here at the centre and their immediate environment and who's in that microsystem. And then I'm going to place that in the context of the broader kind of structural issues that are at play that have an influence. So Bronfenbrenner's model suggests that all these different circles, if you like, are the different contexts in which children are developing, and they have an influence on their development and on their life experiences. So in terms of the focus on the microsystems, then the question is, who are the key people in refugee children and young people's microsystems, and how do their relationships with them impact on resettlement and inclusion? So I'm identifying, for the purpose of this presentation, 3 different groups, and obviously there are other groups that we could identify as well. But for this presentation, I'm going to talk about parents as key, staff in the reception centres or in the direct provision centres, and peers. And obviously I'm very aware there's lots of other important people in their lives, including many of yourselves working in different services, but I just wanted to think about these ones in particular today. So when we think then about parents, we know from the literature that parental support is obviously very important to all children, and particularly in situations of a lot of adversity, the support of parents is going to be crucial. So this, for refugee children, this is the same. Parents are going to be really important. And we know from the literature that there's a huge impact of separation from family members, especially parents, on well-being and integration. So it can be very difficult for people to integrate if they're separated from key family members. Okay? Whereas when reunification occurs, often that process of settling and of integrating becomes easier. So the key role of family in the lives of refugee young people in terms of emotional support, practical support, and financial support, and then families providing, I suppose, a sense of continuity during a time of huge discontinuity. So when somebody's a refugee, there's a massive amount of discontinuity in their lives. If they're able to be with some people who were always there with them, that continuity is obviously going to be very beneficial. Or is likely to be very beneficial. And the reason I've changed that to likely is that at the same time, parenting in this context is really extremely challenging. Okay, so we have to remember that it's not just a refugee child has gone through this horrific experience of fleeing conflict, but actually their parents have also gone through that horrific experience of fleeing conflict or fleeing persecution. So parents themselves are dealing with multiple losses, okay, so that might be losses through death of family members or friends or people in the general community, but also know if the person they're separated from is alive or dead, and there's a lot of questions about it, and there isn't the capacity, I suppose, to be able to mourn that loss because it's so unclear and ambiguous. Trauma and mental health difficulties, then living in the new environment in congregated and largely quite unsupportive settings. Okay, so for benefit of anyone who isn't Irish, we have a direct, or who isn't living here in Ireland and familiar with our system, we have a direct provision system where people live in usually settings that were former hotels, and the staff in these settings are not people who are qualified to work really with, generally speaking, with vulnerable groups, and there's lots of different families living in the same settings. And the research obviously shows the challenges of that context. If parents too are navigating a completely new environment, so they're often with these environments have little social support, they're navigating different parenting styles and expectations, okay, in terms of how do you parent, how do you maybe discipline your child, what's acceptable within this particular context, and how does that differ from your home context. There are obviously often language barriers, and that's a significant, we can all probably relate to that when you go to another country and you just want to get across something pretty basic and you can't do it because you don't have the language. So that for refugee families, of course, is going to be very challenging too. And then experiences of racism and discrimination that refugees often experience, and acculturation stress, so the stress of trying to acculturate or adapt to the new environment, and with all the different aspects that might involve. Okay, so I thought, seeing as I'm in Galway, that it would be very important to reference some West research from the West. So these are from 2 studies that were conducted by people here in NUIG. I'm going to read out the quote just in case anyone can't see it. So this parent who took part in Ugbu's study says that it is mental torture for one to leave his country and family, then coming here to face all these restrictions, and emotional torment is worse. You have to sign in every day. All these restrictions and regimented lifestyle have knock-on effects on our children. It tends to build up. You have no direction, like a zombie waiting for the next instruction from the management or the justice people. How can you be a good parent when you don't have control of your life and cannot control your children's life? You have everything, power, control taken over from you. Who is parenting who? And one of the things that really strikes me actually about this definition is the use of the word restrictions. And you'll note that this quote is from 2014. We've all become very familiar with restrictions, but actually people in the international protection process were familiar with restrictions for a very long time before we became familiar with COVID type of restrictions. And then the second quote here, again from a parent in an interview, there will always be this inferiority, like these people are more superior than I am. I don't know my status in this place, so I don't know what would attract this kind of reaction from other people in the community. They don't see me. It's the people up the hill, and the person is referring to where the hostel was located, up on a hill. The position itself for the hostel, everyone can spot you. You're not in the community, you're separate, so they know that different nationalities are from the hostel. So this sense of being different and being kind of excluded from wider society. Okay, so then I'm going to look now at the second, I suppose, group of people who we could say are in the children and young people's microsystem, and this is staff within reception centres. And this is an area that really hasn't got much attention in the literature, so there tends to be references to staff, but there hasn't been very much research done with staff themselves. We've done a little bit of research, myself and my colleague Karen Smith in UCD, in relation to this, and I'm going to draw on that. So staff, essentially in these settings, are frontline service providers, really. So they're the people that are in reception. If you've arrived as a refugee and you have a question, they're the people who are there who can answer your question. Okay, so they're the frontline service providers. And I suppose the challenges in relation to this are that staff in these settings generally have a background in hospitality. Okay, so they've worked in hotels and obviously have really important skills from that they can bring to direct provision, but they also lack many of the skills that I guess we'd expect people to have when they're working with a vulnerable group, or potentially vulnerable group of people. There's a lack of understanding, often, of the experiences and needs of refugees. There's a lack of role clarity and really, I suppose, quite unfair expectations that people in this context would be providing this service in a very complex environment where there's lots of different people living. And staff in this context also possess a lot of power. Okay, so they have a lot of power by virtue of, living, being in charge of the setting where people are living, being the person to implement the rules, and being mandated reporters under Children First. All these, and just knowing things. So, when you know things about Ireland, and somebody's arrived in and they don't know much about Ireland, you have a lot of power in that context. So, I suppose I'm interested then in the relations between these groups. So what are the relations like between the parents and the staff, and how does that impact on children and young people, refugee children and young people in these contexts? So there's multiple challenges obviously associated with parenting in direct provision and in other congregated settings. So for example, emergency reception and orientation centres, but also now emergency, pre-reception facilities. So basically hotels or B&Bs that are now being used because direct provision is full. Evidence of parents feeling really disempowered. Again, this comes up really frequently in the literature. The overrepresentation of children in direct provision in referrals to TUSLA. So there was an inspection done by HICWA back in 2013 that showed that 14% of children in direct provision in the areas that they'd looked at had been referred to TUSLA, compared to a national average of 1.6%. So massive overrepresentation. And then over-involvement of staff in the lives of residents and the inappropriate use of power. So this research was looking at the needs of refugee children in the emergency reception orientation centres, so resettled programme refugees. And as part of that, so we interviewed 77 people in total, but as part of that, there was a small cohort of 11 people who were staff in the centres. And even though it was a small number of people, we felt it was really important to look closely at the data from the staff members. And there was evidence of problematization and regulation of parenting practices by reception centre staff. So the staff, for example, associate causes of what they perceive to be parenting problems with the parents themselves, rather than considering the system level issues that were at play. So they tended to say things like they're traumatized, it's a different culture, they don't understand our culture, rather than paying any attention at all to the very huge challenges of parenting in the context of a congregated setting. And in response to these problems, staff assumed a regulatory kind of role over parents in different ways. So the analysis of the data showed different ways that they regulated the parenting. So the first one was informing and warning, the second was watching and regulating, the third was taking on parental roles, and then referring to child protection and welfare services. So just talk a little bit about each of these. So first of all, how was parenting viewed? So first of all, the parents themselves talked about, in the research talked about, coming to Ireland to keep their children safe and for the children's welfare. So that in itself is really important. That's why the parents were here in the first place. So every family came here for the sake of the children so that they feel safe. And then the parents also talked about the challenges of parenting in reception centres, so the shared spaces and the rules in particular. And this contrasted with the staff who didn't acknowledge the difficulties of raising parents in these environments, but viewed the parenting practices of reception centre residents as problematic. Okay, so they talked about there was references to the needs for parents to there was reference to the need for parents to step up, and supervision of children was identified as a huge thing and as a big problem. Okay. So what did staff do then in response to these problems that they perceived to be there? So the first thing was that staff informed parents about their duties and warned them of consequences. So this staff member said, at the welcome, so when people arrive initially, we tell them that they're responsible for the children, we're not childminders. However, if we feel they're neglecting the children, then a referral will be done to TUSLA. And then this was really a worrying comment by one person who said, we tell them that when you go to your home, so when you leave the reception centre and you live in the community, you can't leave your child out in the street. When you're inside, you can't. Eventually you'll be deported and those kids will be taken off you. You must keep an eye on your kids. Anything could happen to a child. It could be abduction, it would be anything. So you need to keep an eye. You need to be with your children all the time. And I suppose this kind of, what was really striking about this was the fact that this was being said to us as researchers. It's not like we were doing it covertly and it was overheard. And it was also seen by the people who were saying these things as well-meaning, like they were well-meaning when they said it, well-intentioned, like, well, I need to warn them and let them know that this will happen, so I'm going to make sure they know about it, which I think was really concerning. And the other professionals who took part in the interviews talked about the fact that residents were always threatened with reports to social services. And then a second response was, there was evidence that the residents were basically parenting inside a fishbowl, if you like, so they were being kind of watched. So they know that we're watching them. Again, these are staff. The staff said these things. Your managers have to be, watching all the time, being vigilant all the time. Staff emphasise the needs for rules and regulations, and that's kind of understandable in the context of lots of different people living in one setting. So the first day when they arrive, we have a meeting with them and we put some rules on the table, and after that, we're very strong and we follow these rules. There's no exceptions, because if you do that, once you're lost. Okay, so no individualized kind of care, if you like, or responses. Instead, you have to have rules. And reflecting some findings in other research, there was evidence of governance of how families eat. So there was one person at one time just was not engaging with us in the restaurant, so where everyone ate in a communal setting. She didn't want to take her child there, but then she was told they must come, they must eat in the restaurant, we need to know what they're eating. So she eventually gave in, and she has to come to the restaurant every day. And then another staff response was kind of taking on parental roles effectively. So akin to becoming what Anthony et al. Have talked about, pseudo-parents. So this was in relation to homeless research in the US, I think it was. So this quote from someone working in a centre, so we'd often correct a parent if we saw the children just before mealtime coming out with 6 chocolate biscuits, because obviously they're not going to eat then. And I suppose I look at this quote and I think of my own children, and sometimes the need to give them some chocolate biscuits so that I can just make the dinner. So this was pretty shocking to me that this idea that the person was correcting the parents, I think was just really worrying. And another staff member described her role as like a mommy, taking care of everything, and she said that everything goes through me. And then the fourth, I suppose, response was referring. Okay, so again, managers of centres are mandated reporters, and there wasn't data on the exact number of referrals, but in one centre where there was a lack of supervision and was viewed as a huge problem, only 2 referrals were made. Sometimes other strategies were adopted first, and then referrals were made if parents were perceived to be not listening. And there was concern from other professionals about unnecessary referrals, especially at the beginning when centres are set up first. And I suppose one of the things that was interesting here was that staff often position themselves as in possession of relevant child protection knowledge. So staff, mandated reporters, for example, would have done child protection training. Now, I'm not actually sure the extent of that, but I imagine we're talking about a day or 2 of training. And it seemed in some ways that people then saw themselves as, well, actually, I know this now because I've done the training. And for me, that was really important learning, even for, if I'm delivering training, to be able to say to people that this is the start and this is not, you're not, an expert in child protection because you've done 2 days training. But it was concerning, I suppose, as well, that training could have that impact, I guess, on people. So what are the potential implications then of this for children and young people? So disempowerment of parents and erosion of their sense of autonomy, I think, was really one potential implication. There was implications for relationships between children and their parents, where parents were being corrected by staff maybe in front of their children, or being told how to parent, which I think has huge implications. The stress caused to parents by these interactions is likely to impact children and young people and cause children and young people to worry about their parents. And a young person talked about staff needing to understand the parents as they can't take much more, which I thought was insightful. And the warnings obviously are likely to erode a sense of trust. So as someone from a social work background, we know that, you know, trust in social work can be low anyway, but this, I suppose, these kind of warnings, like you'll be deported if you're not with your child all the time, obviously erodes that further and can really result in a fear of seeking any support from services. Okay, so then I'm going to look at the third microsystem, if you like, so the peers and the importance of peers for children and young people. And the research highlights the crucial role, obviously, played by peers in helping refugee children to resettle in host communities. So the social bonds that are created, so the social bonds are connections with people of a shared sense of identity. So, for example, in the research I was just talking about, Syrian children and young people in reception centres, talking about other Syrian young people in the reception centres, and the bonds, the sense of continuity and cultural identity that was created by being friendly with them. And then the social bridges, so connections with people of a different background. And this draws on Putnam's social capital theory, and it's I should have it referenced in the Indicators for Integration Framework from the UK. So just an example of some quotations. So this is from this study my colleague Karen led on this article. So because there was a few people, so this young person was talking about the reception centre, because there was a few people, like Syrian people with me, so we were like families together. It was really perfect for me. So this is one of the benefits of direct provision and reception centre style accommodation. And also we know from research on unaccompanied minors from previously that when unaccompanied minors lived in hostels in Ireland, this was one of the things that young people really liked, and one of the things that was lost to some extent when we moved to foster care. Which I'm not saying we shouldn't have moved to foster care. We absolutely should have moved to foster care, but it was one of the things that, you know, there are things that get lost even when a system is not a good system of care. So then I moved to here, so the person moved to a community, to housing. I'm just like, I spend lots of time alone. And when you get to Ireland, it's good for you to get friends. So this is the social bridges. It's so good to have a friend. I have lots of friends who are Irish. They help me in school so much. So both kinds of relationships with different peers are really important. But there are challenges too in this context. Okay, so the challenges of having the different context for establishing friendships, and I have a quote I'll show you in relation to that in a minute. The being perceived as different and the racism and discrimination that people experience. Language barriers and the challenges that arise from that. Particular challenges perhaps for girls, and this is actually from the same article by my colleague Karen. So just in relation to, you know, girls maybe not having, so boys sometimes having connections over, like in the study we did, young people had connections over football or over smoking, like having a cigarette, whereas the girls in the study were dressed very differently, they practiced hijab, and were perceived as really different and maybe didn't have those same connections. Trauma impacting on mental health difficulties, impacting on friendships, financial barriers and social exclusion, and then acculturation and parental concerns in relation to that. So maybe the young person is adapting to Irish society, becoming, you know, picking up some of the values of their Irish peers, or trying to, you know, living a different way. Maybe they want to just fit in, and maybe parents then have concerns about them doing that. So these are two quotes from previous research I did. So here you get friends, but they're really, really few. I don't have few friends, but at home, in this person's country of origin, in the evenings you can just go to the neighbours, you just go and visit them. But here everything is on time, so like by appointment. So like when you're going somewhere, like you have to call to make an appointment, but there you just drop in, they don't mind. So this is the different context in which relationships, I suppose, occur. And then another young person, I mean, you feel different. Although you might have Irish friends, you would feel actually different because maybe you would have expensive runners, maybe they would have expensive runners, maybe go to clubs, expensive pens, school books. Like here, you know, in my country, you don't have to compete for fashion like those kind of. But here, someone buys runners in your class and you know everyone must compete, getting more better runners. Okay, so just to give, because I know some of this is a bit depressing, so to give an example of some good practice. So this was in relation to the same study on the needs of refugee children, and an example of youth work that was done with young people who lived in the emergency reception and orientation centre. And the youth work was done with Irish young people and with Syrian refugees. And this youth worker said about the before. So before this happened, he was working with Irish young people, and the Irish young people were aware that Syrian young people had moved into the reception centre. Young people from Irish communities were speaking about the young people who'd come over from Syria as nearly less than, or certainly needy or traumatised. They were very much using stereotypical words that you might associate with kind of the civil war and that kind of migration issue. A lot of it was poor, poverty, war. There were trust issues. And a lot of young lads would certainly have spoken about Islam and Muslim and ISIS and war and fighting and killing and all of that. And then initially the youth worker worked in the reception centre and then changed and decided to work outside of the reception centre and bring the two groups of young people together. And he said that he described the massive transformation that occurred. So when they met each other and got to know each other a bit, all that was gone. And it continued to stay like that. These young people would still speak about the positive experiences of having those ideas being challenged, and those words have never come out of their mouths since. Okay, so how am I doing for time? 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to skip that slide, and just briefly mention about a culture of stress. So this refers to a stress experience when there's a cultural conflict between one's culture of origin and the culture in a new country. And I suppose, again, this is around the meso system of parents, the parental system, and the peer system, and how sometimes they might collide a little bit with one another. So young people, for example, may integrate more quickly than their parents, and tension or discord can arise when different acculturation strategies are utilised. So maybe the young people are trying to just fit in, be like their peers, whereas the parents want them maybe to hold on to their culture of origin. And of course that changes. Different families have different strategies that they use, but sometimes the strategies that are used might be different and lead to some tension or challenges within the family context. Okay, so then just to finish up, just to look at the contextual macro system considerations. So globally, we have an increasingly hostile environment. The border policies are becoming stricter. There's an increasing number of displaced people globally. So every year when I'm teaching in UCD and I'm updating slides, every year I'm saying how many people UNHCR have been displaced. And it started off at 40 million, and it's gone up to, over the years, every year it goes up, and it's something like 75 million now. So this is increasing all the time. There's rising global inequality, there's a rise of the far right and anti-immigrant sentiment. And obviously they're all relevant in the Irish context too. Then there's also, at a national level, the state-sanctioned poverty and exclusion of the direct provision system. Okay, so the fact that has been the policy of our state to have people living in direct provision and to exclude them from society, not to include them in integration policies and so on. The private for-profit actors providing essential services to potentially vulnerable populations, and those driven by profit and not having the staff in place that would be suitable to do this, would be more suited to doing this kind of work. And I should say that there are many people who work in centres who go above and beyond and do their best, but ultimately they don't have the relevant qualifications. And the white paper to end direct provision does suggest that there would be a reception officer with an appropriate qualification in these settings. But I'm not convinced that that's enough. I think there needs to be more than having one person in a setting like this is going to be very, very challenging for that one person in terms of the culture overall. Then the inequitable treatment of different groups of refugees, and I think this is something we need to consider, and it really has come to light recently, and I'll touch on it again in a moment. Obviously our housing crisis, which has knock-on impact, of course, on people in direct provision not being able to leave, and the use of emergency responses then as a result. And then the lack of investment in resettlement supports, and lack of investment in anti-racism training and initiatives. So the future directions then. So firstly, I suppose, to end direct provision, and sadly that's looking like it's going to be very difficult to achieve at the moment, and obviously building houses is part of that process. In the interim, and also then when we have a new reception system, ensuring that we staff all accommodation settings appropriately with ongoing training and reflexive supervision for all. So supervision that reflects on power dynamics that are at play. And I think it's important to acknowledge here that just because somebody is qualified, so if you have social workers, social care, youth workers and so on in these settings, that doesn't necessarily mean they won't use their power inappropriately or they won't be racist. We've lots of international research that points to the racism within the social work profession. So there's a need for this ongoing training and reflexive supervision for all, no matter what their background. I think it's important also to consider what we can learn from care provision for unaccompanied minors. So the system for care for unaccompanied minors was really inappropriate, and we moved to a really good system of care, and unaccompanied minors get very good care provision now. So what can we learn from that shift and from the provision we provide unaccompanied minors? Are there things we can do for young people who are accompanied? Invest in tailored family support services, in youth service and appropriate mental health services. And then engage both individually and collectively with the really uncomfortable reality that not all refugee populations have experienced the welcome that refugees from Ukraine have. So why is this? And how can we harness this solidarity and desire to help that we see now? How can we harness that for the future so that all refugees get that reaction when they come to Irish society? Invest in anti-racism training for all working with refugee children and young people. Engage in long-term planning for refugee resettlement, particularly when we know that climate issues are going to lead to more refugees and in years to come. And then just to finish, obviously, because I'm a researcher, gather data and conduct longitudinal research. And just to leave with this quote, so I think this is just nice to bear in mind when working with refugees. So the label refugee cannot say all about the person who bears it. Being or becoming an asylum seeker or a refugee is a critical life event. It is not the only one, though, and it cannot subsume all of the identities, interests, life projects and concerns of people who are also asylum seekers or refugees. Okay, thanks very much.